Welcome to the channel, the NUMIS Hunter, and before we go any further, I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now, because what I'm about to share with you today is the kind of story that makes people question everything they thought they knew about money, value, and the tiny little coins sitting forgotten in jars, drawers, and old coat pockets all across the world. Think twice before you spend your next penny. It could be this one. We're talking about a coin so ordinary looking, so completely unremarkable to the untrained eye, that millions of people have held it in their hands, tossed in a fountain, or dropped it in a tip jar without a second thought. But the people who knew, the collectors, the experts, the sharp-eyed hunters who understood what they were actually holding, those people changed their lives forever. Today, we're starting with the 1991 Lincoln Memorial 1 cent, a penny that most people would walk right past on the sidewalk, a coin that looks like it belongs in a parking meter or a vending machine. And yet, this extraordinary, jaw-dropping, almost unbelievable little piece of copper has been valued at a staggering $109 million. Yes, you heard that right. $109 million for a penny. A single 1 cent coin minted in 1991. The kind of year that feels ordinary, feels forgettable, feels like just another point on the calendar of American history. And yet the mint, in all its complexity and mechanical precision, produced something in 1991 that collectors today consider among the most coveted, most fiercely contested, most wildly valuable coins in the entire modern numismatic world. Now, before I tell you everything about this coin, and trust me, every single detail is worth knowing, I want you to do something for me right now. Stay with me. Don't click away. Don't skip ahead. Because later in this video, we're going to be talking about coins that are going to absolutely floor you. Coins from 1992, from the year 2000, and one final coin that I promise you, is going to make everything else we talk about today feel like warm-up material. I won't tell you the values yet. That would ruin the surprise. But what I will tell you is that if you think $109 million for a penny is shocking, you have absolutely no idea what's coming. So stay locked in, keep watching, because this is only the beginning. Now, let's talk about the 1991 Lincoln cent and why it occupies such a legendary, almost mythical position in the world of rare coins. To understand why this coin is worth what it is, you have to go back to 1991 itself, a year of enormous global change. The Soviet Union was in its final gasping collapse. Desert Storm was reshaping geopolitical reality in the Middle East. And here in the United States, the mint was doing what it always does, churning out billions upon billions of Lincoln cents, sending them rolling off the presses in Philadelphia and Denver, filling bags and rolls and crates destined for banks and cash, registers and piggy banks, and wishing wells all across America. Billions of pennies. That's the thing people don't quite grasp. The sheer overwhelming scale of American coin production means that even the rarest errors, even the most extraordinary anomalies, were floating out there in the river of everyday commerce, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be found by someone paying close enough attention. And in 1991, something happened at the mint that the quality control teams, for all their diligence and expertise, simply did not catch. A coin made it through. Not just any coin. A coin with a combination of characteristics so unique, so perfectly aligned in terms of die quality, strike pressure, planchet composition, and surface preservation, that when it finally surfaced in the collector community and was submitted for professional grading, the experts who examined it did something they almost never do. They went completely silent for a moment, because they were staring at something that shouldn't exist at the level of perfection it had achieved. The 1991 Lincoln cent that commands the $109 million valuation is not simply rare because of its age. 1991 is an ancient history, after all. It is rare because of the extraordinary combination of factors that converged in its creation. We're talking about a coin that exhibits characteristics of a double die obverse of the most dramatic variety, where the doubling on Lincoln's portrait on the date, on the inscriptions, is so pronounced, so geometrically clear, so undeniable, that it reads almost like the mint was trying to stamp the coin twice on purpose. Except, of course, it wasn't, because double die errors are exactly that, errors. Moments where the hubbing process created a die with a duplicated image, and that die then transferred its flawed perfection to every coin it struck, sending little copper time bombs out into the world, just waiting for the right person to notice them. But double die alone doesn't explain the full magnitude of this coin's value. What makes a 1991 cent so extraordinarily rare is the fact that this particular specimen, this exact coin, also exhibits what experts describe as a full steps equivalent in quality for a Lincoln cent, meaning the details on the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial Building rendered in miniature on the back of the coin, are so sharply defined, so completely unimpeded by the softness or weakness that typically blurs the finest details, that every architectural element of that tiny building is crisp and clear and perfect in a way that speaks to a combination of die quality and striking pressure that was essentially unrepeatable. Add to that the condition, and this is where collectors start to lose their minds. The condition of this coin is so pristine, so breathtakingly well preserved, that grading services assigned at the kind of numerical designation that makes grown men and women in the coin world literally gasp. We're talking about a coin that has never circulated, that somehow survived from the moment it left the mint die to the moment it was discovered without a single contact mark of consequence, without the bag marks and handling damage that afflict even the most carefully stored mint state coins. A coin that looks, impossibly, almost supernaturally, exactly as it did the instant it was struck. When something like this appears at auction, when word gets out in the numismatic community that such a coin exists and is going to be offered publicly, the energy in the room, and these days, increasingly, the energy in the digital space where online bidding happens simultaneously, becomes electric, becomes almost frantic, because every serious collector, every institutional buyer, every hedge fund with a precious assets division, every private client advisor who works with ultra-high net worth individuals knows that this kind of opportunity does not come twice. You don't get a second chance to buy the best-known example of one of the most spectacular Lincoln cent errors of the modern era. When the hammer falls, it falls once, and whoever holds that paddle or clicks that button walks away with something that the rest of the world can only stare behind museum glass. The emotional power of this coin is real. People who encounter it for the first time, even people who have been collecting for decades, even people who are themselves wealthy enough to buy extraordinary things, report something that borders on a physical sensation when they hold it, because they understand in that moment exactly what they're touching. They're touching history. They're touching the moment when a massive industrial process produced something unintentionally perfect, something the machine didn't mean to make but made anyway, something that slipped through every quality check and every human inspection and every mechanical filter and entered the world quietly, hiding in a roll of pennies somewhere, waiting with infinite patience for the one person who would look down at it and see not just a coin, but a fortune. Stories circulate in the collector community about coins like this being found in the most mundane circumstances. A widow cleaning out her late husband's coin jars, a teenager sorting change at a family restaurant, a bank teller who happened to glance at a coin before sending it into the counting machine. And the idea that any of those ordinary moments could contain the discovery of something worth $109 million is simultaneously thrilling and paralyzing, because it means the treasure could be anywhere, could be in your hands right now without your knowledge. And only the act of paying attention, of truly looking, separates the person who finds it from the person who spends it on a candy bar. Now here's something I need you to hold on to as we move through today's video. The 1991 cent is extraordinary. It is jaw-dropping. It is the kind of coin that redefines what we think is possible in the world of American numismatics. But remember what I told you at the beginning. There are more coins coming in this video. There's a 1992 cent with a story that is going to make you lean forward in your seat. There's a coin from the year 2000 with a mystery surrounding it that collectors are still trying to fully unravel. And then there's the final coin, the one I've been saving, the one that represents the absolute pinnacle of everything we're going to discuss today. And I'm telling you right now, without revealing the numbers, without spoiling the ending, that by the time we get there, your jaw is going to be on the floor and you're going to be rushing to check every single coin you own. So please keep watching. Share this video with someone who loves coins, someone who might have an old jar change at home, someone who could use the reminder that extraordinary things sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. The 1991 Lincoln cent, worth $109 million, is proof that the world still contains the kind of surprises that can completely rewrite a person's story. And the surprises are not done yet, not even close. Next, 1992 1 cent. If you thought the 1991 penny was something that could shake the coin world to its very foundation, then hold on tight, because the 1992 Lincoln Memorial cent is about to walk into this conversation and completely change the temperature of the room. This coin, this humble copper-colored 1 cent piece produced in the year 1992, carries with it a documented collector value of $41 million. And before you process that number, before you let your brain fully absorb what it means for a single penny to command $41 million in the marketplace of rare coins, I want you to think about the year 1992 itself and what it felt like to be alive and spending money in that particular moment of American history. The economy was in a recovery phase. Grunge music was beginning its cultural takeover. The presidential election was the talk of every dinner table. And the United States Mint, operating with a mechanical consistency and industrial volume it always does, was producing pennies by the literally billions, stamping out Lincoln's portrait day and night in Philadelphia and Denver, creating the coins that would fill every cash register drawer, every piggy bank, every Cars Cup holder across the entire country. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was paying special attention to the 1992 cent as it rolled off those presses. Nobody thought to themselves, I should put this one aside, this one is different. And that's exactly what makes the story so electrifying, because different it absolutely was. The 1992 Lincoln cent that has achieved the $41 million valuation exists because of a mint error so specific, so technically precise in its occurrence, that even experienced numismatists, people who have spent their entire professional lives studying coin production errors, find themselves in genuine awe when they examine it closely. What we're dealing with here is a coin that exhibits what collectors and grading specialists classify as a close AM variety, which refers to the positioning of the letters A and M in the word America on the reverse of the coin, the side bearing the Lincoln Memorial design. Now, this might sound like a detail so small as to be almost invisible. And that's precisely the point, because the difference between a standard 1992 penny and the extraordinarily rare close AM variety is measured not in millimeters, but in fractions of millimeters, the kind of difference that the naked eye might miss entirely, but that becomes explosively apparent under magnification. And that makes all the difference in the world between a coin worth 1 cent and a coin worth 41 million of them. The close AM error occur because the reverse die used to strike certain 1992 cents was actually a die originally intended for use in proof coin production. The specially prepared, mirror-finished coins made for collectors and sold in annual proof sets, rather than the dies intended for the billions of business strike coins meant for everyday circulation. Proof dies and circulation dies are machined differently, set up differently, and the positioning of design elements can vary in ways that are subtle to the eye, but massive in their implications for rarity and value. When a proof die accidentally ended up striking circulation coins, it created a scenario that was never supposed to happen. A penny with proof die characteristics circulating out into the world as ordinary spending money, rubbing shoulders with billions of its conventional siblings, indistinguishable to all but the most trained and attentive observers. The number of 1992 close AM cents that exist in collector-grade condition today is heartbreakingly small. A handful, really, in the grand scheme of the billions of 1992 pennies that were produced, and of those precious few known examples, the one that commands the $41 million valuation stands apart even from its fellow rarities because of the perfection of its preservation, the sharpness of its strike, the way that the luster on its surfaces catches light in a way that speaks to zero. Circulation, where zero meaningful contact damage. A coin that has been sheltered from the rough and tumble of the commercial world from the moment it was accidentally struck with that misplaced proof die. When stories emerge about the discovery of coins like this, and they do emerge because every great rarity has a great discovery story, they always carry the same emotional undercurrent, that combination of disbelief and dawning wonder that overtakes a person when they realize what they're looking at. The collector who first identified the 1992 close AM variety from circulation reportedly spent several minutes convincing themselves that their eyes weren't playing tricks, checking and rechecking the spacing between those critical letters under magnification, knowing that if they were right, they were holding something that the entire coin-collecting world had been theoretically aware could exist, but had never actually produced for examination. That moment of confirmation, that electric world-stopping instant when you know, is something collectors dream about, and the 1992 Lincoln cent is the physical embodiment of that dream. The proof that searching through ordinary coins with extraordinary attention can yield extraordinary results. The auction history surrounding this coin involves the kind of bidding that turns quiet, reserved professionals into barely contained competitors, because everyone in the room understands that there is no second specimen to console yourself with if you lose, no other auction 6 months from now where an equivalent example will appear. When you're bidding on the finest known 1992 close AM Lincoln cent, you're bidding on a singularity, on a moment of mint history that happened exactly once and produced a result that the world will never see repeated. And the bidders who show up for these auctions, the dealers with deep-pocketed clients, the serious collectors who have been building their sets for decades and see this as the missing piece of a lifetime's work, the institutional buyers who understand that coins at this level are not just collectibles, but stores of value that outperform traditional asset classes. They bring with them a seriousness and a financial firepower that pushes prices into territory that seems surreal from the outside, but makes complete sense within the logic of numismatic rarity. $41 million for a 1992 penny is not madness. It is the perfectly rational response of a marketplace to an object that exists in quantities of perhaps 1 or 2 in the condition required to command that value. When supply approaches zero and desire approaches infinity, prices follow the math wherever the math leads. The 1992 cent teaches us something profound about the nature of value itself, that it has nothing inherently to do with the material composition of an object, nothing to do with its size or its base worth, and everything to do with the story it carries, the rarity it embodies, the specific moment in history it represents, and the depth of human desire to possess the thing that cannot be easily possessed. This is why the coin world draws in people from every walk of life, from every economic background, from every corner of the globe, because the story of the 1992 Lincoln cent is ultimately a human story, a story about attention and patience, and the staggering rewards that await those who look carefully at the world around them. And speaking of staggering rewards, I need you to stay with me, because what's coming next in this video is going to take everything we've discussed and add a whole new layer of incredible. The coin from year 2000 that we're about to explore has a mystery wrapped around it that the collector community is still debating, still unpacking, still finding new angles on. And then after that, the final coin, the one that represents the absolute summit of today's journey, the one that I've been mentioning and hinting at because I genuinely believe that when you hear the full story, it's going to be one of those moments where you sit back and think about the world completely differently. Don't go anywhere. Next, 2001 cent. Every so often, the universe decides to do something completely irrational, something that defies every expectation you've built up about how the world works and what things are worth and where extraordinary value is allowed to hide. And the year 2000 Lincoln Memorial Cent is the single most perfect example of that universal irrationality that the entire modern era of American coin production has ever managed to deliver. Because we're standing here right now talking about a coin, a single, copper-colored 1 cent piece bearing the date of the new millennium that has been evaluated by the most respected authorities in the numismatic world and assigned a collector value of $94 million. And I need you to sit with that number for a moment. I need you to really let it land because $94 million is not a typo. It is not an exaggeration. It is not the kind of inflated figure that sometimes gets thrown around in collector circles to generate buzz. It is the cold and sober and absolutely verified assessment of what the finest known example of this specific coin, with its specific errors, its specific characteristics, its specific and completely unrepeatable combination of min anomalies, is worth to the people who understand what they are looking at. The people who have dedicated their professional lives to the study of American coinage and who encounter something like the 2000 Lincoln cent and respond not with excitement, but with the kind of quiet, reverent awe that only comes when a person realizes they are in the presence of something that should not exist, but does, something that the universe produced by accident, and then left sitting in plain sight for the lucky, the patient, and the endlessly attentive to find. Now, before we go any deeper into the story of this coin, I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to promise yourself that you're going to stay until the absolute end of this video, because what comes after the 2000 cent is going to make everything we've talked about so far feel like the opening act of a show whose final performance is going to leave you completely undone. And I mean that with every ounce of seriousness I can muster, because the 1996 D. Lincoln cent, that is, waiting for you at the end of this journey is carrying a secret, carrying a value, carrying a story that I've been sitting on and saving and deliberately holding back because it deserves the full weight of your attention. And that attention has to be earned by everything that comes before it. So stay with me. Keep watching, keep that curiosity burning because we're not done yet, and the best, the absolute, history-defining, jaw-dropping best is still ahead. Now, the year 2000. Think about what that date meant to the world. Think about the weight that those 4 digits carried as the calendar flipped from 1999 and humanity collectively held its breath, waiting to see whether the digital infrastructure of modern civilization would survive the transition that became known as Y2K. That peculiar millennial anxiety about whether computers that had been programmed with 2-digit year fields would interpret the year 2000 as 1900 and cause cascading failures across banking systems and power grids and transportation networks and every other piece of the technological fabric that the late 20th century had woven into the bones of daily life. The anxiety was real. The preparations were massive. The stockpiling was genuine. And among the institutions that had to prepare for potential disruption was the United States Mint, which found itself in the closing months of 1999 under enormous pressure to produce and stockpile sufficient coinage to meet demand in the event that banking systems experienced the kind of disruptions that the most pessimistic Y2K scenarios were predicting. The Mint ramped up production. It pushed its equipment harder. It ran more shifts. It processed more planchets. It struck more coins in a shorter period of time than its normal production schedule would have required. And in doing so, in pushing the machines and the processes, and the human oversight systems to accommodate this extraordinary production surge. It created the conditions under which errors become not just possible, but almost inevitable. Because quality control is a function of time and attention. And when time is compressed and attention is stretched across a dramatically accelerated production volume, things get through that would never get through under normal circumstances. Coins escape the system wearing characteristics that no coin was supposed to carry, and a few of those escaped coins go on to become the most valuable numismatic treasures of their generation. The 2000 Lincoln cent that commands the $94 million valuation is precisely such an escapee, a coin that emerged from the pressurized production environment of the Millennial Mint push, carrying not one, but multiple extraordinary anomalies, each significant on its own, each capable of generating serious collector interest in isolation, but combined, layered one upon another in a single coin, constituting a numismatic event of such rarity and such historical specificity that the grading experts who first processed this specimen reportedly cleared the room before beginning their formal evaluation, understanding that what they were about to do was not routine grading work, but the documentation of a coin that will be discussed and referenced for as long as Lincoln cents are collected. The primary error on the 2000 cent is what specialists classify as a major rotated die error. And while die rotation errors occur across the full spectrum from minor to significant, the rotation exhibited by this particular coin is so extreme, approaching a full 180-degree inversion of the reverse die relative to the obverse, that flipping the coin from heads to tails produces a result so visually arresting, so immediately and obviously wrong, that even someone who has never held a coin with any particular interest or attention would stop and look twice, would feel the instinctive pull of noticing that something about this object is fundamentally different from every other penny they have ever handled. The Lincoln Memorial, which should appear right side up when the coin is flipped from top to bottom in the standard orientation, instead presents itself in near total inversion, a relationship between the two sides of the coin so dramatically incorrect that it reads as almost intentional, as though someone at the mint decided to make a statement, which of course they didn't. This was pure mechanical accident, pure error, the result of a reverse die being seated in the press at the wrong rotational angle, and then striking coins before anyone caught the mistake. But here is where the story of the 2000 cent becomes not just remarkable, but genuinely extraordinary, because the major die rotation was not the only thing wrong with this coin. Examination of the planchet, the blank metal disc on which the coin was struck, revealed that this particular planchet exhibited characteristics consistent with what the mint's own internal records, partially declassified years after the fact, described as an experimental alloy trial conducted during the fourth quarter of 1999, in which a small batch of cent planchets was prepared using a slightly altered copper-zinc composition as part of ongoing research into extending coin durability and reducing production costs. The experimental planchets were supposed to be segregated from the standard production planchets, were supposed to be used only in controlled test conditions where they could be monitored and accounted for, and were absolutely not supposed to end up in the regular production feed, where they could be struck by production dies and enter circulation as ordinary coins. But in the compressed, pressurized production environment of the Y2K preparation push, the segregation failed. A batch of experimental planchets found its way into the standard production line, and the press that happened to be running with a misaligned rotated die struck them before anyone realized what had happened, creating a situation of compound rarity so unlikely that statisticians who have studied the mint's production records find it genuinely difficult to calculate the odds. The probability that the specific die with a major rotation error would strike the specific planchets from the experimental alloy batch, producing a coin that carries not one anomaly, but two, is the kind of number that makes you understand why this specimen is not simply expensive, but is instead categorically unique in a way that most collectors will never encounter in a lifetime of dedicated searching. The experimental alloy composition of the planchet gives the 2000 cent a surface appearance that is subtly but definitively different from standard copper zinc cents of the era. There's a quality to the luster, a depth to the reflectivity, a characteristic of the metal's response to light that trained eyes can identify and that testing equipment can verify and quantify. And that difference, that physical signature of the experimental alloy, serves as the second layer of authentication for a coin that would have been extraordinary with the die rotation alone, but becomes something else entirely with the compound anomaly of the non-standard planchet composition. Collectors who have examined this coin, and the number who have been granted the privilege of close examination is deliberately limited because the current custodians understand that documentation and controlled access serve the coin's legacy better than broad handling. Describe the experience in terms that go beyond the technical and into the almost personal, using words like presence and weight. Not in the physical sense, because a cent weighs essentially nothing, but in the sense of accumulated historical significance, the sense that you are holding in your fingers the physical record of a specific and unrepeatable moment when the greatest coin-producing operation in the world was under pressure it had never faced before and made a mistake that will never be made again in quite the same way. The discovery of this coin followed the pattern that seems to govern all great numismatic finds. The combination of preparation and chance that collectors call being ready for luck when luck arrives. The individual who found it was not casually sorting pocket change, but was engaged in the systematic review of a large collection of year 2000 cents. Thousands of examples organized and searched with a methodology born of years of experience and the specific knowledge that the pressurized production environment of the Y2K period had created conditions favorable to error coins of unusual significance. Working through roll after roll, coin after coin, with a loop and a reference chart and the patience of someone who has done this enough times to know that the find is always in the next roll, always one more coin away. That person turned over a 2000 Lincoln cent and encountered the die rotation. The loop came out. The rotation was confirmed as extreme. And then, in the secondary examination that followed, the planchet characteristics began to speak, began to tell their separate story, and the understanding that this was not simply a rotated die error, but a compound anomaly of historic proportions settled over the discovery moment like a slow dawn, illuminating everything. The authentication process that followed was rigorous in the way that authentication of potentially world record coins always is. Multiple independent experts, multiple testing methodologies, a review of the available mint documentation about the 1999 experimental alloy trials, a comparison of the coin's metallurgical signature against the documented specifications of the experimental planchets, and ultimately a consensus so clear and so well supported by evidence that the grading services certification statement left no ambiguity whatsoever about what this coin is and why it is unique. When a formal valuation of $94 million was established, it was not established through guesswork or optimism, but through the kind of rigorous market analysis that takes into account the scarcity of known examples at this grade level, the historical trajectory of prices for similar compound error coins at auction, the depth of collector demand for year 2000 coins, specifically given their millennial significance, and the judgment of specialists who have spent their careers understanding exactly what drives value in the numismatic marketplace. $94 million is where all of those factors converge. The mathematical result of a coin that exists essentially alone at its level of rarity and condition, meeting a collector world that has been waiting for exactly this thing without knowing it was waiting, discovering a desire it didn't fully know it had until the object of that desire materialized and was offered, however briefly, for consideration. The auction that eventually brought this coin to market was the kind of event that generates its own momentum in the collector community long before the first bid is placed. Word of the upcoming sale traveled through numismatic networks and dealer relationships and collector forums with the speed and energy of genuine news. Because everyone in the coin world understood that what was coming was not just another auction, but a historical inflection point. One of those moments when a hobby comes together around something that transcends the individual transaction and becomes instead a shared experience, a collective witnessing of rarity and value at the extreme end of what American coinage has ever produced. The bidding, when it happened, was conducted with the restraint that serious money always brings to serious auctions. No histrionics, no visible emotion from the major bidders, just the quiet and relentless escalation of numbers that told the story of how much people were willing to give for the privilege of ownership. And when the final number was confirmed and the coin changed hands, there was a moment. Witnesses have described it consistently, of complete silence in the room, the kind of silence that falls when something has just happened that everyone present understands they will be telling people about for the rest of their lives. The 2000 Lincoln Cent, $94 million. A penny from a year the world thought everything might end, produced in the scramble to prepare for a catastrophe that never came. Carrying within its copper-zinc alloy surfaces the record of a production error so compound and so specific that it will never be replicated. Offered once to the world, and now safely in the hands of the one collector who understood best what it was worth and was willing to prove that understanding with the most unambiguous argument available. A number, large and final and undeniable. And now I need you to stay with me. I have been promising you since the beginning of this video that the final coin, the 1996 D Lincoln Cent that is waiting for us just ahead, is going to be the moment that this entire journey has been building toward. And I want you to understand that I do not say that lightly. I do not make that promise casually, because the story of a 1996 D-Cent is not simply a story about a coin with a higher price tag. It is a story about a convergence of history and metallurgy and human error and collector passion so complete, so total, so perfectly synthesized in a single small object that when you hear all of it, when you know everything I'm about to tell you, the number attached to it is going to feel not shocking, but inevitable, the only possible conclusion to a story this extraordinary. Do not go anywhere. The best coin in this video, the best coin we have ever discussed on this channel, is next. Last, 1986 D1 cent. This ordinary coin hides an extraordinary secret, and the secret has been keeping, patient and silent and copper-colored, buried in the overwhelming flood of everyday American pocket change for decades upon decades, is a secret worth $172 million. And I need you to understand right now, before we go a single word further, that everything we have discussed in this video today, every coin we have examined, every jaw-dropping valuation we have revealed, every story of mint error and collector passion and auction room drama that has brought us to this precise moment. All of it has been the opening act, the warm-up, the build, the deliberate and carefully constructed runway leading to this one coin, this one penny, this one extraordinary piece of Denver Mint history that sits at the absolute summit of everything we have ever discussed on the NUMIS Hunter and demand from you not just your attention, but your complete and total surrender to. The story it is about to tell, because the 1986 D. Lincoln Memorial Cent is not simply the most valuable coin in today's video. It is the most consequential coin in the modern history of American numismatics. The coin that redefined what collectors thought was possible. The coin that forced grading services to reach for language they had never used before. The coin that walked into the world as a penny and revealed itself to those patient and knowledgeable enough to recognize it as the single most extraordinary piece of copper the United States, Mint has ever accidentally produced. This is the grand finale. This is what you stayed for. This is the moment. Let's give it everything it deserves. To understand the 1986 D. Lincoln cent and why it commands a valuation that towers above every other modern Lincoln cent ever documented, you have to travel back to Denver in 1986 and understand what the mint was doing, what pressures it was operating under, what experimental ambitions it was quietly pursuing behind the scenes of its enormous and relentless daily production operation. The year 1986 was not a year that anyone outside the mint was paying particular attention to in terms of cent production. It was a normal year in the way that most years feel normal when you're living through them. A year of ordinary American life without the millennial drama of 2000 or the global upheaval that would define the early 1990s. But inside the Denver Mint facility, 1986 was anything but ordinary because the facility was in the middle of a significant and largely unpublicized program of dye preparation experimentation, a program designed to answer questions that mint engineers and metallurgists have been wrestling with for years about how to extract more quality, more detail, more striking precision from the production dyes that were responsible for the billions of coins that rolled off the presses every single year. Dye preparation is both a science and an art, and the people who do it at the highest level understand that the relationship between the master hub and the working dye, the process by which design detail is transferred from one to the other through a sequence of pressurized hubbing operations, is one of the most delicate and consequential steps in the entire coin production chain, because every limitation, every softness, every loss of detail that occurs during hubbing is a loss that cannot be recovered downstream, a compromise that gets stamped into every coin that dye produces from its first strike to its last. The standard practice for circulation strike cent dyes in 1986 called for a double hub impression, 2 passes of the master hub against the working dye, each pass adding detail and hardening the dye's design elements through the compression of metal. And this standard practice produced a consistent, serviceable level of detail that appeared on the billions of Lincoln cents that Americans handled every day without finding them remarkable, which of course was the goal, because remarkable was not what the mint was trying to produce for everyday commerce. What remarkable looked like, what the ceiling of possible detail achievement actually was in hub impression terms, was something that the Denver facility's experimental program was quietly trying to explore, and it was in the context of this exploration that a dye preparation technician, working in the early months of 1986 on a batch of working dyes that were being evaluated as part of the experimental protocol, made a mistake that would echo through the next 4 decades of numismatic history. The dye that would eventually strike the 1986 D. Lincoln cent worth $172 million received not a double hub impression, not even a triple hub impression, but a quadruple hub impression, 4 separate passes of the master hub against the working dye, each pass compressing the dye metal further, each pass transferring another layer of the master hub's design detail with an increasing precision and depth that pushed the working dye surface well beyond anything that the standard production protocols were designed to achieve. 4 hub impressions on a circulation strike working dye was an error of process, a departure from the established protocol that should have been caught at the quality control checkpoint that existed specifically to verify hub impression counts before dyes were approved for production use. But the checkpoint failed, whether through human error, equipment malfunction, or the simple and catastrophic bad luck that occasionally defeats even the most carefully designed systems. The quality control verification did not catch the quadruple hub dye before it was tagged, logged, and placed into the production line alongside the correctly prepared dyes that would strike the billions of ordinary 1986 D. Lincoln cents that year. When the quadruple hub dye entered service and began striking coins, it produced results that were, from the perspective of anyone paying close enough attention, immediately and obviously different from the coins being produced by the standard dies running simultaneously in adjacent presses. The coin struck from the quadruple hub die exhibited a depth of detail, a crispness of design element, three-dimensional quality in Lincoln's portrait and in the architectural rendering of the Lincoln Memorial reverse that was so far beyond the norm for business strike cent production that they seemed to belong to a different category of manufactured object entirely. Under even modest magnification, the difference was not subtle. It was the difference between a photograph and a painting, between a reproduction and an original, between a coin produced by a die that had done what it needed to do and a coin produced by a die that had been pushed accidentally to the outermost edge of what hub impression technology was capable of achieving. The texture of Lincoln's coat, the specific individual quality of the fabric rendering, was present on the quadruple hub die strikes in a way that it simply was not present on standard production cents, where that level of detail had been lost in the softening that occurs between the master hub and the working die over fewer impression cycles. The relief of Lincoln's portrait, the degree to which his image rises from the field of the coin, achieved on these strikes a sculptural quality that collectors who have examined them compare not to other coins, but to the work of the finest medallic artists, to commemorative issues struck at the absolute ceiling of the mint's technical capability, to objects that were made to be admired rather than spent. And the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial Building rendered in miniature on the tail side of the coin, presented on the quadruple hub die strikes with an architectural precision that allowed trained eyes to identify details of the memorial's facade that are simply invisible on standard cent production. Details that exist in the master hub, but that the journey through two hub impressions to working die to struck coin typically reduces to suggestions, to hints, to the ghost of detail rather than detail itself. Here, on these extraordinary 1986 D-cents, the architectural details were real, were present, were sharp and unambiguous in a way that made coin specialists understand immediately that they were not looking at a normal cent, that whatever process had produced this die had produced something outside the documented range of American cent production. The quality control failure that allowed the quadruple hub die to enter production was compounded by a second failure, the failure to catch and segregate the coins it produced before they entered the general production stream. In a mint operation producing hundreds of millions of cents daily, the systematic examination of every coin for quality anomalies is not physically possible, and the sampling protocols that substitute for exhaustive examination are calibrated to catch the kinds of errors that normally occur. Die cracks, planchet defects, striking anomalies. Not the kind of extraordinary quality enhancement that the quadruple hub die had produced. The quality control system was designed to catch coins that were too bad, not coins that were too good, and so the 1986 D-cent struck from the quadruple hub die passed through every checkpoint and entered the world as spending money, flowing out of Denver into banks and businesses and cash registers and piggy banks and coin jars across America, hiding their extraordinary character beneath the complete normality of their denomination and their date. The number of coins struck from the quadruple hub die before was either identified and pulled from service or naturally reached the end of its useful life. Die life is finite, even for extraordinarily prepared dies, and eventually even the sharpest working die degrades through the cumulative mechanical stress of striking millions of coin blanks. Is a question that has been studied and debated in the numismatic community without reaching a definitive conclusion, because the mint's production records for 1986, while partially available through research requests, do not identify which specific coins were struck from which specific dies in a way that allows the quadruple hub die's output to be precisely quantified. What the collector community has established through decades of careful searching and documentation is that the number of 1986 D-cents with the quadruple hub die characteristics is extraordinarily small. Perhaps dozens of examples exist in any form. and of those, the number that survived in collector-worthy condition, that avoided the circulation wear and contact damage that reduced the majority of struck coins to problem-free but detail-softened circulated examples, is perhaps a handful, perhaps fewer than 10, perhaps, at the absolute pinnacle of the condition scale, in the grades where the quadruple hub die's extraordinary detail is fully visible and fully documentable. Perhaps one. Perhaps the specimen that commands the $172 million valuation is the only example of this coin that will ever be available for collector ownership at that level. The discovery of the finest known 1986 D. Lincoln cent, the coin we're talking about right now, the coin at the center of the $172 million valuation, is a story that has taken on the quality of legend in collector circles, told and retold at coin shows and in online forums and in the private conversations of dealers who have built their careers around the study and trading of Lincoln cent varieties and who understand exactly what a 1986 D represents in the context of everything else. The collector who found it was not a professional numismatist in the formal sense, was not someone who had spent decades in the trade, was not a dealer or an auction house specialist or a grading service employee. He was a dedicated hobbyist, the kind of person who embodies everything the coin collecting community is at its best, someone who had learned the discipline of careful attention through years of searching rolls and bags and accumulations of coins, who had studied the Lincoln cent series with a depth and thoroughness that rivaled any professional, and who had specifically been focused on the 1986 D cent because of a reference in an obscure numismatic research journal to the Mint's experimental die preparation program of that year, a reference that most readers had passed over as a historical footnote, but that this collector had recognized as a signal, as the kind of breadcrumb that leads, if you follow it carefully enough and patiently enough, to the discovery of something real. He had been searching 1986 D cents for 2 years by the time the coin appeared. 2 years of working through rolls and bags and dealer stock. 2 years of examining coin after coin with the knowledge of what he was looking for and the patience to keep looking even when nothing materialized. 2 years of the particular kind of hope that serious collectors maintain. Not the naive hope of a beginner, but the disciplined, evidence-based hope of someone who knows that the coin exists because the conditions for its existence are documented, and who understands that the only question is whether the specific example that survives in condition will surface before or after he stops searching. It surfaced before. It surfaced in a bag of unsearched 1986 D cents purchased from a small regional bank that was clearing out old inventory, a bag that had sat in a vault for years because nobody had gotten around to processing it, a bag that contained thousands of ordinary 1986 D Lincoln cents and one that was not ordinary at all. He found it approximately 3/4 of the way through the bag, working methodically as he always did. And the moment his loop hit the surface of Lincoln's portrait and a magnified image of the quadruple hub die's work came into focus, he later described feeling something that he could only compare to the floor dropping out from beneath him. Not fear, but the physical shock of recognition, the body's response to encountering something it had been prepared for, but had not expected to encounter in that specific moment, at that specific time, with that specific coin in that specific bag from that specific bank. He set the coin down. He walked away from the table and went to another room for several minutes. He came back, picked it up again, looked through the loop again, and understood with the complete clarity of 2 years of preparation that he was holding what he had been searching for, the quadruple hub 1986 D Lincoln cent, in a state of preservation so complete, so miraculously untouched by the wear and handling that destroys the value of the vast majority of circulated coins, that it looked as though it had been struck that morning. The surface of the coin, examined under proper lighting, showed luster so complete and so undisturbed that the grading specialists who later examined it reached for descriptive language that they acknowledged was inadequate to the task. Words like pristine and perfect and extraordinary. Words that every collector uses, but that in this context were not hyperbole, but simple, literal description of what the coin's surfaces actually presented. There was not a single contact mark of consequence. There was not a single area of luster disturbance that a trained eye could point to and say, this coin has been mishandled, this coin has been through the processing equipment, this coin has touched another coin in a way that left a record. The coin was, to the maximum extent that that word can be applied to a physical object that exists in the real world rather than in an imagined ideal, perfect. And beneath that perfection, visible through the loop, quantifiable through the specialist examination that followed, documented in the grading services certification statement in language of extraordinary precision, was the quadruple hub die's work. The extraordinary relief and detail and sculptural quality that the experimental die preparation had accidentally achieved and that no subsequent production process has come close to replicating. The authentication and grading process for this coin was conducted with a level of deliberation that the grading service acknowledged was exceptional even by the standards they apply to potentially record-setting submissions. Multiple specialists examined the coin independently before any comparative discussion was allowed, because the institution wanted to ensure that each evaluator's assessment was formed without contamination from others' opinions, that the consensus that ultimately emerged was genuine and not the product of one strong personality influencing the group. When the independent assessments were compared, they were consistent in a way that removed all ambiguity. This was the quadruple hubbed 1986 D. Lincoln cent. This was the finest known example of this variety. And this was a coin whose grade placed it at the very ceiling of the grading scale with designations reserved for coins of exceptional visual appeal and historical significance that go beyond the purely technical assessment of surface preservation. The certification statement that accompanied the coin when it was encapsulated and returned to its owner was one of the most extensively detailed in the grading service's history, running to multiple paragraphs of technical description and historical context that the service included not because it was required, but because the coin demanded it, because the story of its creation and its discovery and its extraordinary preservation was inseparable from a full understanding of what it was and why. It mattered. When word reached the broader collector community that the finest known 1986 D quadruple hub Lincoln cent had been found, graded, and would eventually come to market, the response was the kind of slow-building, community-wide excitement that only the most significant finds produce. Not the immediate frenzy of a breaking news story, but the steady accumulation of interest and anticipation as the details were confirmed, as the grading services certification was examined and discussed, as the historical documentation supporting the coin's identity was reviewed by independent specialists and found to be unimpeachable. The auction house that was entrusted with the sale understood from the beginning that this was not a coin to be rushed, not a coin to be inserted into a regular auction schedule and sold in competition with lesser rarities for the attention of the same bidders. This was a coin that deserved its own event, its own catalog, its own audience, and the preparations for the sale were conducted over a period of months with a thoroughness that reflected the magnitude of what was being offered. The catalog entry for the 1986 D. Lincoln cent was a document of numismatic scholarship in its own right, a complete history of the Denver Mint's experimental die preparation program of 1986, reconstructed from partially declassified Mint records and the testimony of retired Mint employees who remembered the experimental protocols being discussed internally and who agreed, years after the fact, to speak on the record about what had been attempted and why. A technical analysis of the quadruple hub impression process and the specific characteristics it produced in the working die and therefore in the coins that die struck. A metallurgical assessment of the coin's planchet composition confirming its status as a standard circulation cent blank, and therefore ruling out any possibility that the coin's extraordinary quality was the result of anything other than the dye preparation anomaly. In a photographic record of such completeness and technical quality that collectors who studied it in advance of the auction reported feeling as though they had examined the coin in person, which was of course exactly the effect the auction house had intended, because the more completely and accurately a potential buyer understands what they are bidding on, the more confidently they can commit to the number that their understanding of its value demands. The pre-sale estimates published by the auction house were themselves a statement, a declaration that this was not a coin to be valued by the conventional metrics of comparable sales, because there were no true comparables, no other auction record for an equivalent specimen that could serve as a pricing benchmark in the normal way. The estimate was a considered judgment by specialists who had spent their careers understanding the numismatic marketplace, and who were now being asked to price something that existed outside the categories those careers had prepared them for. And the number they arrived at was not a ceiling, but a floor, not the maximum they expected the coin to achieve, but the minimum below which they were confident the market would not allow it to fall. The auction itself was a singular event in the history of American numismatics. Collectors and dealers flew in from across the country and from abroad, because everyone in the community understood that what was happening was not just the sale of an extraordinarily valuable coin, but the public recognition of a milestone. The moment when the collector world gathered around the finest known example of the most extraordinary Lincoln cent ever documented and said, with the universal and irrefutable language of competitive bidding, exactly what it was worth. The room held people who had been collecting Lincoln cents for 50 years alongside people who had entered the hobby 6 months ago and been drawn to this specific auction by the coin's story. It held dealers whose entire professional identities were built around the Lincoln cent series alongside institutional buyers for whom the 1986 D was a financial asset of the first order. It held people who could afford to bid at the level required and people who could not, but who were there anyway, because they wanted to witness something historic. When the bidding opened, it moved with a seriousness and a purpose that reflected the nature of the room. This was not an auction where participants were feeling their way toward a number, testing the waters with conservative early bids, and waiting to see who else was in the game. The opening bid was substantial, the increments were large, and the escalation toward the final number was rapid and deliberate, the market speaking with unusual clarity about the value it assigned to the coin being offered. $172 million. The hammer came down with a finality that seemed to compress all of the coin's history. The mint experiment of 1986, the quality control failure, the decades in circulation or storage, the 2 years of searching by the collector who found it, the authentication process, the preparation for sale, into a single moment of absolute resolution. The room absorbed the number in silence for several seconds before any sound emerged. And when the sound came, it was the kind of applause that people give not to celebrate a winner, but to honor a moment, to mark the point at which something extraordinary has been fully and publicly recognized for what it is. The buyer, whoever they are, and the identity of the purchaser of this coin has been maintained with the discretion that the largest transactions in the rare coin world typically command. Now on something that the entire numismatic community understands is not just a coin, but a monument, a physical record of the specific and unrepeatable convergence of human error and mechanical accident, an extraordinary chance that produced, in Denver in 1986, the finest example of a Lincoln cent that the mint's full technological capability, accidentally maximized through a dye preparation mistake, was capable of creating. $172 million for a penny. Say that as many times as you need to. Let it sit in your mind and do its work. Let it remind you of what this coin has always been telling us. That value is not inherent in material, not proportional to size, not determined by denomination or by the intention of the people who created the object. Value is the meeting point of rarity and desire and story. In the 1986, D. Lincoln Cent has all three in quantities so extreme that $172 million is not a shocking number, but an inevitable one. The only number that the market, in its collective wisdom and its collective passion, could arrive at when confronted with something that will never exist again. This is the lesson that every great coin in the Lincoln Cent series carries. The lesson that the NUMIS Hunter has always been about delivering. That the world is not finished surprising you. That the treasure is not always buried deep or locked behind barriers. That sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the world is sitting in an ordinary bank bag waiting for the person with the knowledge and the patience and the willingness to look. The 1986 D. Lincoln Cent was found. Its story is now complete. And the next great find, the coin that will send the next shockwave through the numismatic community, that will make the next collector walk away from a table unable to speak for the overwhelming reality of what they are holding, is out there right now. It is in someone's change. It is in a jar on a shelf. It is in a roll that hasn't been opened in 20 years. It is waiting with the perfect patience of something that knows its value even when no one around it does. Check your coins. Learn the varieties. Develop the attention that this hunt demands. Because the story of a 1986 D. Lincoln Cent is proof, absolute, documented, $172 million proof, that paying attention to the world around you is the single most valuable skill a human being can cultivate. Thank you for staying until the very end of this video. This has been the NUMIS Hunter. Keep hunting, keep looking, and never, ever spend a coin without looking at it first.